Okay, this is going to be a Dark Souls 1 rings tier list for both PvP and PvE. PvP on the left and PvE on the right. I've got the tiers split up here into situationally useful, generally useless, and completely useless. These are pretty self-explanatory, so I'm not going to explain them further. The reason this is in one video instead of two separate videos is because there aren't very many rings. A lot of the rings that are useless are just useless in general, so there's a lot of crossover between the two tier lists, and I would rather upload one like 20-minute long video than two 10-minute long videos. So that's exactly what I'm going to do. Without further delay, let's get started. The Cat Covenant ring is completely useless in both PvP and PvE. The Ring of Fog is generally useless in both PvP and PvE. In PvP, it makes you a little bit harder to see, and in PvE, it decreases the range at which enemies will aggro you. But also, sometimes that's a bad thing. Sometimes you, like, especially with groups of enemies, you usually want to pull an enemy away from a group, and you can do that from further away without the Ring of Fog on, or just a bow. Both of which are kind of antithetical to the use of a Ring of Fog. The Ring of the Evil Eye is almost completely useless in PvP and generally useless in PvE. The only situation in which the Ring of the Evil Eye can have an effect in PvP is if you're like about to die to poison or toxic or something, or lava even, and you kill someone and it refunds a little bit of HP, and suddenly you have enough HP to survive. But that's an extremely niche situation, and I wouldn't be surprised if that's actually never happened to anyone before ever. In PvE, it's a little bit more useful, but still not very useful, because you get a little bit of HP back when you defeat enemies, but yeah. It's not very much HP. You'd have to defeat a lot of enemies to refund a significant amount of HP, and you're fairly likely to take damage in the process of doing that. So, not very useful. The Hornet Ring is generally useful in PvP and situationally useful in PvE. In PvP, the Hornet Ring, well, actually in both, the Hornet Ring increases the damage of backstabs and ripostes. Backstabs happen a lot in PvP. Ripostes not so much, but also occasionally. And then in PvE, the Hornet Ring is only useful against enemies that can actually be hit with backstabs or ripostes, which are kind of rare among generic enemies, and especially rare among bosses. There's only one boss, I think, that can actually be critically struck. So that's the situation in which it's useful. Also, generally speaking, the common enemies will die to a single backstab or riposte anyway. So the Hornet Ring is much less useful in PvP or PvE than it is in PvP. The Ring of Favor and Protection is generally useful in both PvE and PvP. I think the Ring of Favor and Protection is overrated in both PvP and PvE, because it just makes you never want to take it off, especially in the case of PvE specifically, it makes you never want to take it off. Yeah, it gives a decent chunk of health, a decent chunk of stamina, and quite a bit of equip burden, but not an exceptional amount of any of those stats, just a decent mix of them. So yeah, there are a lot of builds that function perfectly well without the Ring of Favor and Protection, and having two open ring slots in PvE specifically is extremely useful. Also very useful in PvP, but arguably not quite as useful. I guess it depends. The Calamity Ring is completely useless in both PvP and PvE unless you want to not have access to one of your your ring slots and also die faster. It just makes you take more damage. The Covetous Gold and Silver Serpent Rings are completely useless in PvP and situationally useful in PvE. Either you're farming an item or souls, or you just killed a boss and you're trying to get more souls, and you're wearing one of them, or you don't and you're not. That's all. The Rusted Iron Ring is pretty much completely useless in PvP, but I guess if somehow you find yourself in the swamp, then you might as well be wearing it. Or maybe at the bottom of Sen's Fortress for whatever reason. I don't know how you got down there, but yeah, somehow you did. The situationally useful aspect of the Rusted Iron Ring in PvE, I think, is so short-lived that it's not really even worth going out of your way to get the Rusted Iron Ring. But that's just my personal view on it. I think the last time I picked up the Rusted Iron Ring and used it was probably in like 2014. But if you really wanted to, then I guess you could. The Eastwood Grain Ring is pretty much completely useless in PvP because even if you're using a crystal weapon, the odds of your weapon breaking over the course of a single fight are pretty low, and you should just use a new crystal weapon at the start of each fight if you yeah, that's it. You would never want your crystal weapon to break during a fight. That's just obnoxious. And then in PvE, similarly, even if you're using a crystal weapon, you'd probably like to have a ring slot. So just not very useful. The Darkwood Grain Ring is generally useful in both PvP and PvE. You get bonus iframes on your fast rolls and your fast backsteps. Pretty nice. Also bonus range on, I think, both. The Covenant of Artorias in PvP is completely useless, and in PvE is situationally useful. You can't PvP in the Abyss without the use of cheats, so completely useless in PvP. And then for PvE, there's one boss fight where you need to wear this ring for the duration of the boss fight, and if you're not in that boss fight, then you don't even need to wear it when you're in the area where you fought the boss, so it's pretty much useless at that point. The Orange Charred Ring is situationally useful in both PvP and PvE. The situation where the Orange Charred Ring is useful is you're in Izalith. Otherwise, it's not very useful. Well, there's also the fact that it gives your kicks a little bit of fire damage, but it's not very much fire damage, although that is a neat little aspect of the ring. The Old Witch's Ring is completely useless in both PvP and PvE. The Chloranthy Ring is considered to be generally useless in PvP, and I believe it's very strong in PvE. It increases your stamina regen by a lot. I think it's even more than a Green Blossom. It might not be. It's comparable to a Green Blossom, though. And also it can be stacked with Green Blossoms or Power Within. In PvP, you usually don't need that much stamina regen, but yeah, I guess you could fit it into a build. There are just better options, though. And also everyone uses Green Blossoms anyway. And then in PvE, you could stack it with Power Within for just like almost zero downtime on your stamina. It will basically take longer for your stamina to start recharging again. Well, not actually longer, but it'll almost take longer for your stamina to start recharging again than it will for the stamina bar to actually fill up, depending on how much stamina you actually have. The Havel's Ring is generally useful in both PvP and PvE. Havel's Ring can allow you to mid-roll in very heavy armor, which is useful for PvP because mid-roll is not that bad. It can also allow you to fast roll in some pretty heavy sets. It's also generally useful in PvE for the same reasons, although mid-rolling is probably... man, that's tough to say. Is it more or less detrimental to mid-roll in PvE compared to PvP? I don't know. But regardless, it's very helpful. Strong ring, a lot of equip load. Pretty helpful. The Tiny Beings ring is generally useless in both PvP and PvE, gives you a 5% bonus to your maximum HP, which isn't very much, and takes up a ring slot. The Ring of Steel Protection is generally useless in both PvP and PvE. The Havel's Ring is, at least like mid to late game, better than the Ring of Steel Protection, just because you can usually equip more armor thanks to the Havel's Ring, more physical defense thanks to the Havel's Ring than you would gain from the Steel Protection. Might be rarely true, but it's sometimes true. Also, there's a lot of other things the Havel's Ring lets you do that the Ring of Steel Protection does not, like gain poise or wield a heavier weapon. All the stone plate rings are generally useless in both PvP and PvE. At least in PvE, if you know what you're up against, you can choose a stone plate ring specifically for that encounter. Because the speckled stone plate ring, while it gives bonuses against all the elemental types, it gives less in each individual elemental type than the specific stone plate of that type. So yeah, but generally speaking, you take less damage by ending fights faster, and you end fights faster by dealing more damage. So you would rather have a ring that allows you to deal more damage, like the Leo ring or the Red Tearstone ring or the Bellowing Dragon Crest ring, or even like technically the Havel's ring, like, you know, being able to wield a larger weapon, I guess technically constitutes more damage, as well as even the Chloranthy ring. Like basically dealing more damage is better than taking less damage in a lot of situations. The bite rings. Okay. So in the PvP side of the tier list, the Blood Bite Ring is situationally useful. Maybe if you're a turtle, then sometimes you should think about when it's round 2 of a tournament and someone has decided to switch to a gold tracer and equip a Blood Bite Ring instead of being a fucking idiot. And then maybe you will beat that guy and go on to win the tournament. But instead, you didn't, because you're a fucking idiot. The Poison Bite Ring is pretty much useless. There are very few builds that use Toxic or Poison anyway. And you can always just use Moss, which is a little harder against Bleed. And then there are no builds that inflict Curse in PvP. The Blood Bite Ring, the Poison Bite Ring, and the Curse Bite Ring are all pretty much useless in PvE. You could argue that they have each a situation in which they could be used, but generally speaking, in the case of the Blood Bite Ring, not really. There aren't very many enemies that inflict bleed. In the case of the Poison Bite Ring, not really. Generally speaking, the Poison Bite Ring is often not enough resistance to not get poisoned by the swamp. And maybe you'll be able to tank a second Toxic Dart, but like, no. You're not going to switch to the Poison Bite Ring just for those situations, almost certainly. And then the Curse Bite Ring, you usually just have enough curse resist. I mean, as long as you're not naked with 0 humanity, then you probably have a sufficient amount of curse resistance to not get afflicted with curse in pretty much any situation without the Curse Bite Ring. And even if you didn't, you could always, instead of putting on the Curse Bite Ring, you could just like wear any armor that has curse resistance, or pop some humanity, or, you know, your other options. Or you just cure the curse when you get cursed. The Red Tearstone Ring is situationally useful in PvP and generally useful in PvE. In PvP, you might switch to it when you're low. That's cool, I guess. You do a lot more damage when you're below 20%. So sometimes you're below 20% and you have an option or an opportunity to switch to the Red Tearstone Ring, and then the fight is in some ways more equal. In PvE, you could even just have the red Tearstone Ring equipped while you're fighting something. Maybe you get dropped down below 20% and suddenly your damage output's crazy, or maybe you enter a fight in hyper mode and you just do a bunch of damage to things because you're already in hyper mode. But either way, it's pretty strong. The blue Tearstone Ring is generally useless in both PvP and PvE. The damage threshold is the same as the red Tearstone Ring. Maybe if it was reversed, if it was like below 50%, you get a 20% bonus to defenses, then it wouldn't be so bad. But since your health is already so low, the bonus to defenses is like usually not really enough. It is a pretty large bonus though, but still. The Ring of Sacrifice and Rare Ring of Sacrifice are both completely useless in PvP, as well as being situationally useful in PvE. In PvE, you're running back to your Bloodstain and you're wearing one of them maybe sometimes, otherwise you're probably not wearing one of them. Or you're just like going off and exploring something new. I mean, actually, for new players, I could see the Rings of Sacrifice being like pretty useful just for exploring new areas. The Bellowing Dragon Crest Ring is generally useful in both PvP and PvE, just increases your magic damage output by a lot, including pyromancies, and also I think it increases the damage of Wrath also, but I'm not sure. And it's a lot of damage, so yeah. The Lingering Dragon Crest Ring is situationally useful in both PvP and PvE. It increases the duration of your buffs and makes Power Within deal less damage per tick, while also increasing its duration. So that's pretty cool, I guess. But in both PvP and PvE, generally speaking, you only have the Lingering Dragon Crest Ring equipped while you're buffing, and then you would switch it to something else. So that's the situation where it's useful, is you're about to buff, you have it equipped, you have your buffs on, you take it off. That's it. Fine. It's not technically completely useless. But the Slumbering Dragon Crest Ring is pretty close to being like one of the most useless rings in PvP, if not on par with like a lot of other rings that are all equally completely useless, while not technically being completely useless. But it just masks the sound of your footsteps and your dodges. It's not very helpful. PvE, maybe it's a little more useful, but meh. The Dust Crown Ring is generally useless in both PvP and PvE. Half of your maximum HP is not usually a good trade-off for having bonus spell casts. Things like Soul Arrow already have a lot of casts, and things like Soul Spear don't have many casts, but have a very high damage output, so you would tend to use them on bosses, and most bosses cannot survive 4 Soul Spears from a leveled mage. Although, I guess if you're not super strong of a mage, then maybe having more casts is better. And if you're already being one-shot, then losing half your maximum HP isn't that bad. But also, if you think about it, Dusk Crown Ring increases your spellcast count by 50%, and the Red Tearstone Ring increases your damage by 50%. So the Red Tearstone Ring is basically just a better Dusk Crown Ring, because you don't have to land as many spells, and the cumulative effect is actually equivalent. So yeah, Dust Crown Ring not very useful, both in PvE and PvP, and for the exact same reason. Half your HP is just a lot, and a ring slot. It costs half your HP and a ring slot. That's a lot. The and 1, 2, 3. Oh, whoops. Okay. All 3 of these rings have one thing in common. They all increase your like spell capacity. They increase your attunement slots by like 1 each. So either you have a buff on an extra slot and you use it and then de-equip the ring, or you don't and you don't. Although sometimes I guess some people might have it equipped just for an extra attunement slot, but like that's not really that useful. And then also the Darkmoon Blade Covenant ring opens the door at the bottom of the tomb or whatever. Not the Tomb of the Giants. It opens the tomb, Gwyn's tomb in Anne Orlando, so that's cool, I guess. The Ring of the Sun's Firstborn, generally useless in both PvP and PvE. I believe it increases the strength of miracles. The Ring of the Sun Princess increases your miracle resonance, I think. Both of those are pretty much completely useless, but not quite. The Leo Ring is generally useful in PvP and generally useful in PvE. I think the Leo Ring is relatively underrated as a ring. I think it's probably the ring that requires the most skill to use to its fullest potential. And also to a certain extent, certain aspects of the Leo ring are just out of your control. But regardless, the damage increase is significant in both PvP and PvE. The Wolf Ring in PvP, I think, is considered to be generally useless. You can stack poise very heavily with it, or if you are a build with not very much endurance, you can still have a significant amount of poise. But I think the general consensus is that it's kind of similar to the Ring of Steel Protection in that the Havel's Ring almost kind of does what it does by virtue of allowing you to equip more armor. And similarly with the Ring of Steel Protection, Havel's Ring gives you both poise and resistances, whereas the Ring of Steel Protection and the Wolf Ring each give you one of those things. So the Havel's Ring is just kind of better in a lot of cases. That's pretty much the same situation as in PvE. Generally, you would rather have both poise and resistances rather than one or the other. The Hawk Ring is technically not completely useless in PvP and also technically not completely useless in PvE. All it does is increase the effective range of bows. That's not particularly useful. Well, that's all. That's the rings. There you go. Enjoy. Bye.